At dawn, in the first century of the Common Era, something impossible happened at the edge of the Theban necropolis. A stone statue sang. The sound emerged from the northern Colossus, one of two massive quartzite figures that stood, and still stand, at the entrance to what was once the largest mortuary temple in Egypt. The statue was cracked. Its upper half had collapsed in an earthquake decades earlier, leaving the lower half fractured, exposed, and open to the desert air. And every morning, as the first rays of the sun struck the shattered stone, the statue produced a sound, not a rumble, not a groan. A sound, high, clear, musical, unmistakably deliberate. Witnesses described it as the striking of brass. Others compared it to the snapping of a lyre string. Others said it sounded like a human voice, muffled, distant, emerging from the stone as if the stone itself were speaking. The Greeks, who heard the sound and who required a mythology to explain it, decided that the statue was Memnon, the legendary king of Ethiopia, the son of Eos, the goddess of dawn. Memnon had fought in the Trojan War, leading his Ethiopian warriors against the Greeks in defense of Troy. He had been killed by Achilles, and his mother, the goddess of the dawn, wept for him every morning, her tears forming the dew that covered the earth at sunrise. The sound of the singing statue was Memnon's cry, the dead hero greeting his mother at dawn, his voice emerging from the stone each morning as the first light touched his face. The mythology was beautiful, the explanation was wrong. The statue was not Memnon. It was Amenhotep III, a pharaoh of the 18th dynasty who had ruled Egypt during the 14th century BC, roughly 1200 years before the Greeks heard the singing. The sound was not a divine cry. It was physics, probably the rapid evaporation of moisture from within the cracked stone as the morning sun heated its surface, or the thermal expansion of the fractured quartzite, producing vibrations that resonated through the cracks and cavities of the damaged statue. The phenomenon was natural, the effect was supernatural, and the combination, a natural phenomenon producing a supernatural impression, drew visitors from across the Greco-Roman world to the edge of the Theban necropolis, where they stood in the pre-dawn darkness, waiting for the sun, waiting for the sound, waiting for the moment when a 3,000-year-old stone statue opened its mouth and sang. By the end of tonight, you're going to understand what the Colossi of Memnon actually are. Not singing statues, but the last surviving remnants of the largest mortuary temple ever built in Egypt. You're going to understand the pharaoh they represent, Amenhotep III, who ruled during the golden age of the 18th dynasty, and who built on a scale that no pharaoh before or after him could match. You're going to understand why the singing stopped, and what the silence tells us about the relationship between damage and beauty, between destruction and creation, between the earthquake that broke the statue and the music that the breaking produced. And you're going to understand the modern excavation that is, piece by piece, uncovering the lost temple that the Colossi once guarded. A temple that was, in its day, the most magnificent building on the west bank of the Nile. Before we get started, if you find these mysteries as fascinating as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It's a simple action, but it helps this channel reach more curious minds like yours. Now let's begin. To understand the Colossi of Memnon, begin with the king they represent, because the Colossi are not the point. The Colossi are the doorposts. The temple behind them was the point, and the temple is gone. Amenhotep III ruled Egypt for approximately 38 years, from roughly 1386 to 1349 BC. His reign was one of the longest and most prosperous in Egyptian history, a period of unprecedented wealth, diplomatic achievement, and monumental construction that is often described as the golden age of the New Kingdom. Egypt under Amenhotep III was the richest country in the ancient world. Gold flowed from the mines of Nubia. Trade goods arrived from Syria, Mesopotamia, Cyprus, and the Aegean. The diplomatic correspondence preserved in the Amarna letters, discovered at the site of Akhetaten, the city that Amenhotep's son Akhenaten would later build, reveals a pharaoh who was courted by every major ruler in the Near East, who exchanged gifts with the kings of Babylon, Assyria, Mitanni, and Hatti, and who was addressed with the deference due to the most powerful monarch in the world. Amenhotep invested his wealth in building. He was, by any measure, one of the most prolific builders in Egyptian history, constructing temples, palaces, and monuments across the length of the Nile Valley. His constructions at Luxor Temple, the inner sanctuaries, the colonnade, the court, are among the finest surviving examples of New Kingdom architecture. His palace at Malkata, on the west bank at Thebes, was the largest royal residence ever built in Egypt, and his mortuary temple, the building that the Colossi of Memnon once guarded, was the largest mortuary temple in the Theban necropolis, and, at the time of its construction, the largest religious structure in Egypt, surpassing even the Temple of Amun at Karnak. The temple covered an area of approximately 35 hectares, roughly 450 meters wide and 700 meters long. It contained multiple pylons, courtyards, hypostyle halls, and a peristyle court surrounded by colossal statues of the king. The building material was primarily sandstone, with granite and quartzite used for the most important architectural elements: the colossal statues, the column bases, and the sacred shrines. The temple was decorated with hundreds of statues, colossal, seated figures of Amenhotep, standing statues of the goddess Sekhmet, more than 700 of which have been recovered from the site, granite sphinxes, and quartzite figures of the king in various poses and costumes. The Colossi of Memnon, the two massive seated statues that stood at the entrance to the first pylon, are the most visible surviving elements of this vast complex. Each statue is roughly 18 meters tall and weighs an estimated 720 tons. They are carved from quartzite sandstone, a material that is significantly harder and more durable than the ordinary sandstone used for the temple's walls and columns. The quartzite was quarried either at El Gabal El Ahmar, near modern Cairo, or at Gebel El Silsileh, near Aswan. In either case, the stone was transported more than 600 kilometers to the temple site. The logistics of quarrying, transporting, and erecting two 700-ton statues, each one carved from a single block of stone, each one requiring hundreds of workers, months of labor, and a specialized infrastructure of ramps, sledges, and rollers, represent one of the most impressive engineering achievements of the New Kingdom. The statues depict Amenhotep III, seated on a throne, his hands resting on his thighs, his face looking eastward toward the Nile and the rising sun. At the pharaoh's feet, carved in smaller scale on either side of the throne, are the figures of his wife, Queen Tiye, and his mother, Mutemwiya. The throne itself is decorated with the Sematawi motif, the symbol of the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt, showing the papyrus and the lotus plants tied together around the hieroglyph for unity. The symbolism is clear. The pharaoh sits enthroned, flanked by the women who gave him life and legitimacy, above the symbol that represents the unity of the kingdom he rules. The colossi are not merely statues. They are a political statement, a declaration of royal authority, carved in the hardest available stone, erected at the entrance to the largest temple in the necropolis, visible from the river, visible from the fields, visible from everywhere on the west bank of the Nile. The architect of the mortuary temple was Amenhotep, son of Hapu, one of the most celebrated figures in the history of Egyptian architecture. Amenhotep, son of Hapu, was not a member of the royal family. He was a commoner, born in the delta town of Athrebis, trained as a scribe, promoted through the ranks of the civil administration, and eventually appointed to the position of chief architect, responsible for the planning and construction of the pharaoh's building program. His achievements were so extraordinary that he was, uniquely among non-royal Egyptians, granted a mortuary temple of his own on the west bank at Thebes, an honor that was normally reserved exclusively for pharaohs. In the Ptolemaic period, more than 1,000 years after his death, he was deified, worshipped as a god of wisdom and healing. His cult centered at the very mortuary temple he had built for Amenhotep III. The temple that Amenhotep, son of Hapu, designed was unprecedented in its scale and in its ambition. The complex covered approximately 35 hectares, an area larger than the Temple of Amun at Karnak, larger than any other single temple in the Theban necropolis, larger than any mortuary temple that any pharaoh before or after Amenhotep III would ever build. The complex included at least 3 pylons, massive trapezoidal gateways, each one flanked by colossal statues of the king. The first pylon, the outermost, the entrance, was flanked by the two quartzite colossi that we know as the Colossi of Memnon. The second and third pylons were flanked by additional colossal statues, some of quartzite, some of granite, some of alabaster, each one a monumental representation of the pharaoh, each one contributing to the processional experience of approaching the temple through a series of increasingly massive gateways. The peristyle court, the large open courtyard surrounded by a colonnade of columns, contained rows of colossal standing statues of Amenhotep III in the form of Osiris, the god of the dead. The Osirid statues, each one roughly 8 meters tall, lined the colonnade, creating an avenue of divine kings that the visitor would pass through on the way to the inner sanctuaries. The statues wore the white crown of Upper Egypt on one side and the red crown of Lower Egypt on the other, symbolizing the pharaoh's rule over both halves of the kingdom, demonstrating, through the multiplication of his image, the comprehensiveness of his authority. Behind the peristyle court lay the hypostyle hall, a vast columned space, its ceiling supported by massive papyrus columns, its walls decorated with reliefs depicting the pharaoh's relationship with the gods. The hypostyle hall was destroyed by an earthquake, probably around 1200 BC, roughly 150 years after the temple's construction. A fire in the hypostyle hall in 1996, which damaged the surviving fragments, was one of the events that prompted the launch of the Modern Conservation Project. The sheer number of statues in the temple complex was staggering. More than 700 statues of the goddess Sekhmet, the lion-headed goddess of war and disease, were distributed throughout the temple, arranged in rows, each one a slightly different variation on the same theme. The goddess seated or standing, holding an ankh or a papyrus scepter, her lion face looking out from beneath a solar disk. The purpose of the Sekhmet statues was protective. The lion goddess was understood to guard the temple against disease, against enemies, against the forces of chaos that threatened the cosmic order. The multiplication of her image, 700 identical guardians, arrayed around the temple in every direction, was a form of magical protection, a visual incantation, a stone spell cast against the forces of destruction. The irony is bitter. The 700 Sekhmet statues, which were placed in the temple to protect it from destruction, could not protect it. The temple was destroyed anyway, by earthquakes, by floods, by the quarrying of later pharaohs. The Sekhmet statues, scattered and toppled and buried in the debris, were themselves the victims of the destruction they were supposed to prevent. The guardian goddess failed, the protection did not work, and the statues, recovered by Sarusian's excavation, reassembled and displayed at the site, stand now not as guardians but as witnesses, witnesses to the scale of the building that housed them, witnesses to the magnificence that was lost, witnesses to the failure of divine protection to prevent the destruction of the most magnificent temple on the west bank of the Nile. The transportation of the quartzite blocks for the Colossi was one of the most ambitious logistical operations of the New Kingdom. Each block, weighing roughly 720 tons, had to be quarried from the parent rock, shaped into a rough form at the quarry site, transported by sledge and roller to the Nile, loaded onto a barge, floated downstream for 600 kilometers, unloaded on the west bank, and hauled overland to the temple site. The transportation required a specially built barge, a vessel strong enough to carry 720 tons of stone without sinking, stable enough to navigate the Nile without capsizing, and large enough to accommodate the block and the crew necessary to manage it. The quarrying itself was a major engineering operation. Quartzite is one of the hardest stones used in Egyptian architecture, significantly harder than limestone or sandstone, requiring specialized tools and techniques. The quarry workers used copper and bronze tools, chisels, picks, and wedges, supplemented by harder stone implements for the most difficult work. The block was separated from the parent rock by cutting channels around its perimeter, inserting wooden wedges into the channels, and soaking the wedges with water. The swelling of the wet wood generated enormous pressure, enough to split the stone along the prepared cut, releasing the block from the bedrock. The process was slow, labor-intensive, and required a level of skill and experience that was available only to the most specialized quarry workers in Egypt. The prosperity of Amenhotep III's reign was not merely a matter of wealth. It was a matter of cultural confidence, a confidence that expressed itself in the scale and the ambition of the pharaoh's building program. Amenhotep did not merely build big, he built comprehensively, constructing temples, palaces, monuments, and civic structures across the length of the Nile Valley, from Nubia to the Delta, each one contributing to a construction program that was designed to demonstrate, in stone, the power and the glory of the most prosperous reign in Egyptian history. The Amarna letters, the diplomatic correspondence discovered at the site of Akhetaten, modern Tel El Amarna, provide a window into the international relations of Amenhotep's reign. The letters, written in Akkadian cuneiform on clay tablets, include correspondence between Amenhotep III and the rulers of Babylon, Assyria, Mitanni, Hatti, and the Levantine city-states. The letters reveal a world of diplomatic gift exchange, political alliance, and royal intermarriage, a system of international relations in which Egypt occupied the dominant position, receiving tribute, dispensing gold, and exchanging princesses with the major powers of the Near East. The gold was central. Egypt's gold reserves, derived from the mines of Nubia, which Amenhotep controlled through a network of fortresses and administrative centers, were the largest in the ancient world. The pharaoh dispensed gold to his diplomatic partners as a gesture of generosity and as a demonstration of his wealth. The Babylonian king Kadashman-Enlil, writing to Amenhotep, complained that the gold he had received was insufficient. "Your gold is like dust in your country," he wrote, implying that Egypt's gold reserves were so vast that the pharaoh could afford to be more generous. The complaint is revealing. It shows that even the most powerful rulers in the Near East were dependent on Egyptian gold, and that the pharaoh's control of the gold supply gave him a diplomatic leverage that no other ruler could match. The construction of the mortuary temple, the temple that the Colossi of Memnon were built to guard, was the most ambitious expression of this wealth and this confidence. The temple was designed to surpass every previous mortuary temple in the Theban necropolis, to be larger, richer, more elaborately decorated, more comprehensively staffed, and more spectacularly situated than any mortuary temple that any pharaoh had ever built. The ambition was fulfilled. The temple was, at the time of its construction, the largest religious structure in Egypt, larger than Karnak, larger than any temple that had ever been built. The Colossi of Memnon, the entrance statues, each one 18 meters tall, each one weighing 720 tons, were merely the prelude to the splendor that lay behind them. Queen Tiye, whose figure is carved at the feet of both colossi, was one of the most remarkable women of the New Kingdom. She was not of royal blood. Her parents, Yuya and Thuya, were non-royal courtiers from the town of Akhmim in Middle Egypt. Her marriage to Amenhotep III was a departure from the tradition of royal endogamy, the practice of pharaohs marrying within the royal family to maintain the purity of the divine bloodline. Tiye's non-royal origin did not diminish her status. She became the great royal wife, the most powerful woman in Egypt, the mother of the future pharaoh Akhenaten, the diplomatic correspondent of foreign kings, and the subject of some of the finest portraits in New Kingdom art. Tiye's depiction at the feet of the colossi is significant. In Egyptian art, the figures depicted at the base of a colossal statue are typically the most important family members, the individuals whose relationship to the pharaoh defines his identity and his legitimacy. By placing Tiye at his feet, alongside his mother Mutemwiya, Amenhotep was declaring that his wife was as important to his identity as a pharaoh as his mother was. The declaration was both personal and political, an expression of love and an assertion of the queen's institutional status. Tiye was not merely the pharaoh's wife. She was the pharaoh's partner, the woman who shared his throne, who bore his heir, who participated in the governance of the country, and whose image, carved in stone at the base of the largest statues in Egypt, would endure for as long as the stone endured. The stone has endured. The image of Tiye is still visible at the base of both colossi, worn by weather, softened by time, but recognizable. The small figure of the queen, standing beside the massive throne of the king, is one of the most intimate images at the site. a reminder that behind the colossal scale of the monument, behind the 720 tons of quartzite and the 18 meters of carved stone, there was a family, a king and his wife, a son and his mother, a dynasty and its women. The Colossi are monumental. The figures at their feet are personal, and the combination, the monumental and the personal, the colossal and the intimate, the public statement and the private relationship, is one of the most affecting qualities of the Colossi of Memnon. The modern site of the Colossi, known archaeologically as Kom el Haytan, the Hill of the Walls, is located roughly half a kilometre southeast of Medinet Abu, the mortuary temple of Ramesses III. The site is surrounded by agricultural land, sugarcane fields, irrigation canals, and the small villages of the West Bank farming community. The contrast between the monumental scale of the Colossi and the domestic scale of their surroundings is one of the most striking features of the site. The statues, which were designed to be seen from a distance, to be experienced as the entrance to a vast temple complex, now sit in the middle of a farming landscape, dwarfing the houses, the fields, and the people who pass them daily on their way to work. The Colossi are remnants of a different world, a world of pharaonic scale, of divine kingship, of colossal ambition, stranded in the modern world of agriculture and daily life, sitting in their field like giants from another era, patient, weathered, and waiting. The core problem of the Colossi of Memnon is the problem of disappearance. The disappearance of the temple they were built to guard. The mortuary temple of Amenhotep III was the largest and most magnificent temple on the West Bank at Thebes. It was also the most ephemeral. Within 200 years of its construction, the temple was largely destroyed, reduced to its foundations by a combination of earthquakes, Nile flooding, and the systematic quarrying of its stone by later pharaohs who needed building material for their own projects. By the time of the 19th dynasty, the dynasty of Seti I and Ramesses II, only a century after Amenhotep's death, the temple was already being dismantled. Meremptah, the son of Ramesses II, reused so many blocks from Amenhotep's temple in the construction of his own mortuary temple nearby that scholars have been able to identify individual blocks in Meremptah's walls that were originally carved for Amenhotep's building. The destruction was comprehensive. The mud brick elements of the temple, the enclosure walls, the subsidiary structures, the administrative buildings, dissolved in the annual Nile floods that inundated the West Bank. The sandstone elements, the walls, the columns, the pylons, were quarried by later rulers or collapsed in the earthquakes that periodically struck the region. The granite and quartzite elements, the colossal statues, the column bases, the hardest and most durable components, survived, but they were scattered, toppled, buried, and forgotten. The result is a paradox. The largest mortuary temple in the Theban necropolis is also the least visible. The temples of Hatshepsut, Ramesses II, and Ramesses III, all of which are smaller than Amenhotep's temple, are well preserved, their walls standing, their reliefs legible, their architectural plans comprehensible. Amenhotep's temple, the temple that dwarfed them all, that contained more statues, more columns, more decorated surfaces than any of them, is almost invisible. Its walls are gone, its columns are gone, its pylons are gone. All that remains above ground are the colossi, the two entrance statues standing alone in the floodplain, guarding an entrance that no longer exists, flanking a gateway that leads nowhere. The Colossi of Memnon are, in this reading, the most poignant monuments in the Theban necropolis. Two massive statues, standing in an empty field, looking out over a temple that has vanished. They are doorposts without a door, guardians without a building to guard, sentinels standing watch over nothing, over a field of sugarcane and standing water that covers the foundations of what was once the most magnificent building on the west bank of the Nile. And then the earthquake came. In 27 BC, roughly 1300 years after the Colossi were erected, a powerful earthquake struck the Theban region. The earthquake caused severe damage to the northern Colossus, collapsing its upper half, cracking its lower portion, and creating the fissures and cavities through which the famous singing sound would soon emerge. The earthquake did not merely damage the statue, it transformed it, converting it from a mute stone monument into a musical instrument, from a political symbol into a sacred wonder, from a forgotten relic of a vanished temple into the most famous tourist attraction in the ancient world. The transformation is the core paradox of the Colossi of Memnon. The earthquake that damaged the statue created the phenomenon that made it famous. The destruction was the creation, crack was the voice, the damage was the music, and the statue, which had stood in silence for 1300 years, which had been forgotten by the world, which had become a doorpost without a door, suddenly sang. And the world came to listen. The singing of the Northern Colossus was, for roughly 2 centuries, one of the most celebrated phenomena in the ancient world. A tourist attraction of the first order, drawing visitors from across the Roman Empire to the edge of the Theban necropolis. The visitors who came were not merely curious travellers, they were pilgrims, men and women who made the journey to the West Bank specifically to hear the voice of Memnon, to witness the miracle of the singing stone, to experience, in the pre-dawn darkness of the Egyptian desert, a phenomenon that was understood to be divine. The accounts left by ancient visitors are remarkably consistent in their descriptions. Strabo, the Greek geographer who visited the Colossi in the late 1st century BC, described the sound as resembling a slight blow, a sharp percussive noise, like the striking of a metal object. Pausanias, the Greek travel writer of the 2nd century of the Common Era, compared the sound to the breaking of a string of a lyre, a sudden musical snap, followed by a brief resonance. Publius, a Roman poet who visited the site around 130 of the Common Era, wrote a series of poems about the experience, describing the pre-dawn darkness, the rising sun, the moment of anticipation, and the sound itself, which he characterized as a greeting from the dead hero to his divine mother. The graffiti on the Northern Colossus, more than 130 inscriptions, carved or painted on the statue's lower surfaces, provide a detailed record of the visitor experience over a period of roughly 2 centuries. The inscriptions include the names of the visitors, the dates of their visits, and, in many cases, their personal responses to the experience. Some inscriptions record successful visits. The visitor heard the sound and was moved by it. Others record unsuccessful visits. The visitor waited at dawn and the statue remained silent. The variability of the phenomenon, the fact that the singing did not occur every day, added to its mystique. A visitor who heard the sound was blessed. A visitor who did not was invited to return. The social range of the visitors is remarkable. The graffiti include inscriptions by Roman governors, military officers, poets, scholars, and ordinary travelers. They include inscriptions by women, a rarity in ancient tourist graffiti, including Julia Domna, the empress, who visited the Colossi with her husband Septimius Severus during his Egyptian tour. The inscriptions are in Greek and Latin, the 2 languages of the educated classes of the Roman Empire, and they demonstrate that the Colossi of Memnon were, in the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Common Era, one of the most famous and most visited sites in the ancient world. The mythology of Memnon, which the Greek and Roman visitors brought with them to the site, added a layer of emotional and literary significance to the acoustic phenomenon. Memnon, in the Homeric tradition, was the king of Ethiopia, a noble warrior who led his people to the defense of Troy, who fought bravely against the Greeks, and who was killed by Achilles in single combat. His mother Eos, the goddess of the dawn, was devastated by her son's death. She wept for him every morning, her tears forming the dew that covered the earth at sunrise. The identification of the singing Colossus with Memnon transformed the acoustic phenomenon from a curiosity into a myth, a story of love, loss, and divine grief, enacted every morning at the edge of the desert, in the sound of a broken stone greeting the dawn. The identification was based on a linguistic coincidence. The prenomen of Amenhotep III, Nebmatra, was pronounced in the late period as something like Nimaria or Mimaria. The Greek ear, hearing this name, conflated it with Memnon, the name of the Trojan War hero. The conflation was not scholarly. It was casual, the kind of folk etymology that arises when travellers encounter an unfamiliar name and assimilate it to a name they already know. The result was that the colossal statues of Amenhotep III became, in the Greek and Roman imagination, the statues of Memnon, a hero from a different mythology, a different culture, a different continent. The Egyptian pharaoh was erased, the Greek hero was superimposed, and the Colossi, which had been Egyptian for 1300 years, became Greek, adopted, renamed, and reinterpreted by the culture that heard them singing. The adoption of the Colossi by the Greek-speaking world is a case study in cultural appropriation, in the process by which one culture takes the monuments of another and assigns them new meanings, new names, new mythologies. The Colossi are Egyptian. They depict an Egyptian pharaoh. They were built by Egyptian craftsmen for an Egyptian temple as part of an Egyptian mortuary program. But their fame, the fame that has made them one of the most recognized monuments in the ancient world, is Greek. It was the Greeks who heard the singing. It was the Greeks who named the statues Memnon. It was the Greeks who wove the acoustic phenomenon into a mythological narrative that transformed a broken stone into a grieving hero. The Egyptian identity of the statues was lost in the process, submerged beneath the Greek mythology, forgotten by the tourists, unknown to the visitors who carved their names on the stone and who believed, with complete conviction, that they were standing before the image of a Greek hero, not an Egyptian king. The recovery of the Egyptian identity. The re-identification of the Colossi as statues of Amenhotep III, achieved through Champollion's decipherment of the hieroglyphs and the subsequent reading of the inscriptions on the statues' bases, is one of the achievements of modern Egyptology. The recovery was not merely a correction of a historical error, it was a restoration of cultural identity, the return of the Colossi to their original owners, the reassertion of their Egyptian origin, the reversal of the cultural appropriation that had renamed them Memnon. The statues are once again Amenhotep's. The name Colossi of Memnon persists. It is too well established, too familiar, too deeply embedded in the historical and literary record to be changed. But the identity behind the name is now clear. The statues are Egyptian, the singing was Greek mythology, and the truth, the historical, archaeological, epigraphic truth, is that the most famous singing statues in the ancient world were not singing at all. They were cracking, and the cracking, heard at dawn through the filter of Greek mythology and Roman tourism, became a voice. The destruction of Amenhotep's mortuary temple is one of the most instructive lessons in the archaeology of the Nile Valley. A lesson about the relationship between ambition and vulnerability, between the scale of a building and the probability of its survival. The temple was built on the floodplain of the Nile, the low-lying agricultural land between the river and the desert. The location was prestigious. The floodplain was the most visible, most accessible, most dramatically positioned land on the West Bank. A temple built on the floodplain could be seen from the river. It could be approached from the cultivation. It could be experienced as a transition, from the green living, water-fed land of the fields to the sacred precinct of the temple, to the dry, dead, desert-bound realm of the necropolis beyond. But the floodplain was also the most dangerous location available. Every year, the Nile flooded. Every year, the waters rose from the riverbed, spread across the low-lying land, and inundated the fields that surrounded the temple. The temple was designed to withstand the annual flood. Its stone foundations were raised above the expected water level. Its mud brick enclosure walls were plastered and sealed against moisture. Its sandstone surfaces were treated with protective coatings. But the flood was unpredictable. In some years, the waters rose higher than expected, exceeding the temple's designed flood tolerance and reaching surfaces that were not intended to be submerged. Over centuries, the repeated cycles of submersion and exposure, wetting and drying, expansion and contraction, salt deposition and salt crystallization, weakened the temple's fabric, degraded its sandstone, dissolved its mud brick, and undermined its foundations. The earthquakes compounded the damage. The Theban region is seismically active, positioned near the margins of the African and Arabian tectonic plates. It has experienced significant earthquakes at irregular intervals throughout recorded history. The earthquake of roughly 1200 BC, which occurred about 150 years after the temple's construction, was the most destructive. It collapsed portions of the temple's superstructure, toppled statues, and cracked the stone foundations. The earthquake of 27 BC, the earthquake that damaged the northern Colossus and initiated the singing phenomenon, caused additional damage to the already weakened structure. The quarrying by later pharaohs was the final destructive force. Meremptah, the son of Rameses II, was the most aggressive quarrier. He removed hundreds of blocks from Amenhotep's temple for use in his own mortuary temple, which was built nearby. But Meremptah was not alone. Other pharaohs of the 19th and 20th dynasties also raided the site, removing carved blocks, column drums, and architectural elements for reuse in their own constructions. The quarrying was not vandalism, it was pragmatic. The temple was already damaged, already partially collapsed, already functionally obsolete. The stone was good, the carving was excellent, and the cost of quarrying finished blocks from a ruined temple was far less than the cost of quarrying raw blocks from a distant quarry. The result is that the materials of Amenhotep's temple are distributed across multiple later buildings throughout the Theban necropolis. Scholars have identified blocks from Amenhotep's temple in the walls of Meremptah's temple, in the foundations of the temple of Ai and Horemheb, and in various other 19th and 20th dynasty structures. The temple was not merely destroyed, it was dispersed, its components scattered across the necropolis, its carved surfaces incorporated into other buildings, its identity dissolved in the stones of later structures. The dispersion of the temple's materials raises a philosophical question about the nature of archaeological survival. The temple of Amenhotep III has not disappeared. Its materials still exist. In Meremptah's walls, in the Colossi that still stand, in the Sekhmet statues that Sarusian's team has recovered. The temple's substance has survived. Its form has not. The blocks are still there. The building is gone. And the question, whether a building survives if its materials survive but its form is lost, is a question that the Colossi of Memnon pose with particular urgency. The Colossi themselves offer an answer. The Colossi survive. They are recognizable. They are identifiable. They are, in every meaningful sense, the same objects that were erected 3,400 years ago. But their meaning has changed. Utterly, completely, irrecoverably changed. They are no longer doorposts. They are no longer guardians of a temple. They are no longer elements in an architectural system. They are standalone monuments, famous, iconic, photographed by millions, but stripped of the context that gave them their original meaning. The Colossi survive in form but not in function. The temple survives in material but not in form. And neither the Colossi without their temple, nor the temple without its form, is complete. Both are fragments, both are partial survivals, and both, in their incompleteness, testify to the scale of what was lost. The scale was extraordinary. The temple, at 35 hectares, was roughly the size of 70 football pitches. It contained multiple pylons, courtyards, hypostyle halls, and sanctuaries. It housed hundreds of colossal statues and more than 700 Sekhmet figures. It employed an army of priests, scribes, craftsmen, and laborers. It controlled agricultural estates that funded its operations. It was, in modern terms, a university, a hospital, a concert hall, a government building, and a cathedral, all in one. The most comprehensive religious institution on the west bank of the Nile, serving every function that the pharaoh's mortuary cult required. And it is gone. Gone not because it was poorly built. The colossi, which were built to the same engineering standards as the temple, have survived for 3,400 years. Gone because the location was wrong. The floodplain, which gave the temple its visibility and its prestige, also gave it its vulnerability. The water that sustained the fields also destroyed the temple. The river that made the site valuable also made it dangerous. And the temple, the largest and most magnificent mortuary temple in the history of the Theban necropolis, paid the price for its position. The mortuary temple of Amenhotep III was designated, in the Egyptian terminology of the period, a temple of millions of years, a term that the New Kingdom pharaohs used for their mortuary temples, indicating that the temples were intended to function for eternity, sustaining the pharaoh's cult for millions of years after his death. The designation was not merely rhetorical. It reflected a genuine intention. The temple was built to last forever, its stone construction designed to resist the destructive forces of time and climate, its institutional structure designed to maintain the daily rituals and the annual festivals that would sustain the pharaoh's ka, his spiritual essence, in the afterlife. The daily ritual at the mortuary temple followed the same general pattern as the daily ritual at every Egyptian temple. Each morning, the priests entered the sanctuary, opened the shrine, washed and anointed the cult statue of the pharaoh, dressed it in clean linen, presented offerings of food, drink, and incense, and recited the hymns and prayers that sustained the pharaoh's car. Each evening, the priests closed the shrine, extinguished the lamps, and sealed the sanctuary until the next morning. The ritual was repetitive, the same actions performed every day, every year, every decade, every century, without variation, without interruption, without cessation. The repetition was the point. The car needed to be fed continuously. A single day without offerings would weaken the car. A prolonged interruption would endanger the pharaoh's afterlife existence, and the temple, with its institutional structure, its endowed lands, its hereditary priesthood, was the mechanism that ensured the continuity of the ritual. The endowment of the temple, the agricultural estates that funded the daily ritual, was substantial. The temple received income from lands distributed across Upper Egypt, producing the grain, oil, wine, and linen that were needed for the daily offerings and the maintenance of the priestly staff. The endowment was designed to be permanent. The lands were dedicated to the temple in perpetuity. Their income was earmarked for the ritual program, and their management was entrusted to the temple's administrative hierarchy. The economic base of the temple was intended to be self-sustaining, generating sufficient income to maintain the ritual indefinitely, without requiring additional royal subvention. The system worked for a while. The temple of Amenhotep III was maintained for roughly a century after the pharaoh's death. The daily ritual was performed. The annual festivals were celebrated. The priestly hierarchy operated. The agricultural estates produced their income. The system functioned as designed. But the earthquakes, the floods, and the political disruptions of the late 18th dynasty gradually undermined the temple's institutional base. The lands were reassigned, the priesthood was dispersed, the ritual was discontinued, and the temple, which had been designed to last for millions of years, ceased to function as a religious institution roughly 150 years after its construction. The cessation of the ritual meant the cessation of the temple's purpose. Without the daily ritual, the temple was merely a building, a large, empty, increasingly damaged building, sitting on the floodplain, slowly dissolving in the annual floods, gradually being quarried by later pharaohs who needed its stone for their own projects. The building had been designed to sustain the pharaoh's car for eternity. It had lasted for a century and a half. The gap between the intention and the reality, between the millions of years that the temple was supposed to endure, and the 150 years that it actually functioned, is the gap that defines the Colossi of Memnon. The statues were built to guard a temple that would last forever. The temple lasted for 150 years. The statues have lasted for 34 centuries, and the guardians have outlived the building they were guarding by more than 3,000 years. The outliving is the paradox. The secondary element has survived. The primary element has not. The doorposts have outlasted the door. The guardians have outlasted the fortress. The accessory has outlasted the essential. And the result, two colossal statues, standing alone in a field, guarding nothing, flanking nothing, watching over the remains of a temple that was supposed to last forever, but that lasted for less than 200 years, is one of the most instructive lessons in the archaeology of the ancient world. The lesson is that durability and significance are not the same thing. The most significant building, the temple, the primary structure, the building that gave the statues their purpose, was the least durable. The least significant elements, the doorposts, the entrance markers, the accessory structures that were secondary to the temple's function, were the most durable, and the most durable elements are, today, the only ones that remain. The material explains the discrepancy. The temple was built primarily from sandstone, a soft, porous material that is vulnerable to moisture, to salt weathering, and to the mechanical forces of earthquake and flood. The colossi were carved from quartzite, a hard, dense, non-porous material that is resistant to moisture, resistant to weathering, and resistant to the mechanical forces that destroyed the temple. The material choice was deliberate. The pharaoh chose the hardest available stone for the most visible elements of his building, and the softest available stone for the largest elements. The result was a building with an inverted durability profile. The most visible parts, the colossi, were the most durable, while the least visible parts, the walls, the columns, the pylons, were the least durable. The building was designed to be impressive from the outside and functional on the inside. The outside has survived, the inside has not. The location of Amenhotep's temple on the floodplain, the decision that made the building vulnerable to the very forces that would destroy it, was not a mistake. It was a calculated choice, made for theological and practical reasons that were perfectly rational within the framework of Egyptian religious thought. The floodplain was sacred, the annual inundation of the Nile, the event that deposited the fertile silt that sustained Egyptian agriculture, that marked the beginning of the agricultural year. That was the most important natural event in the Egyptian calendar, was understood as a cosmic act. The god Hapi, the deity of the flood, rose from his cave at the first cataract each year and sent the waters northward, covering the land with the black silt that made Egypt the most fertile country in the ancient world. Building a temple on the floodplain was therefore an act of theological engagement, a declaration that the temple existed within the flood, that the temple participated in the cosmic cycle of inundation and recession, that the temple was part of the natural world rather than separate from it. The annual flooding of the temple precinct was not merely a hazard, it was a ritual, a physical reenactment of the creation narrative, in which the primeval waters covered the earth before receding to reveal the first land. The temple, emerging from the flood waters each year, was the primeval mound, the first land, rising from the chaos, establishing order in the midst of the formless, creating the sacred in the midst of the profane. The theology was elegant, the engineering was challenging, and the building, caught between the elegance of the theology and the challenges of the engineering, endured for less than 2 centuries before the theology's elegant flood destroyed the engineering's best efforts. The waters that were supposed to renew the temple's sacred significance also dissolved its mud brick walls, saturated its sandstone columns, and undermined its foundations. The theology and the engineering were incompatible. The sacred flood was also the destructive flood, and the building, caught between the two, was destroyed by the very force it was designed to celebrate. The mortuary temple of Amenhotep III was not the only building on the Theban West Bank that was affected by the annual flood. All of the mortuary temples were, to some degree, impacted by the rising waters. But Amenhotep's temple, positioned on the lowest and most exposed portion of the floodplain, was the most vulnerable. The temples of Hatshepsut at Deir el-Bahari, Ramesses II the Ramesseum, and Ramesses III at Medinet Habu were built on higher ground, positioned at the edge of the desert, above the flood level, on terrain that was less fertile but more stable. Amenhotep's choice of the lowest ground was the most ambitious and the most vulnerable, the most dramatic position for the most dramatic temple, at the cost of the most dramatic vulnerability. The comparison with the other mortuary temples illustrates the trade-off between visibility and durability that every builder must navigate. Amenhotep chose visibility. He built on the flat, open, low-lying land where his temple would be seen from the maximum distance, from the river, from the east bank, from the approaching processions, from everywhere on the west bank. The visibility was spectacular, the durability was not, and the temple, which was the most visible building in the Theban necropolis during Amenhotep's lifetime, is now the least visible, its remains buried beneath the fields that cover the flood plain. The temples that chose durability, the temples built on higher ground, at the edge of the desert, on stable terrain, are still standing. Hatshepsut's temple, built against the cliff face at Deir el-Bahari, is one of the best preserved temples in the necropolis. Ramesses III's temple at Medinet Habu is one of the most complete. The temples that chose the high ground sacrificed visibility for durability. The temple that chose the low ground sacrificed durability for visibility. And the result, after 34 centuries of natural selection by earthquake, flood, and erosion, is that the most visible temple is gone and the most durable temples remain. The Sorusian project's water management system The pumps and drains that lower the water table beneath the temple foundations addresses the very problem that destroyed the temple in the first place. The modern technology does what the ancient engineering could not. It controls the water. It keeps the foundations dry. It prevents the salt crystallization and the stone degradation that the annual flood once caused. The irony is thick. The ancient Egyptians worshipped the flood. The modern conservators fight it. The ancient temple was built on the flood plain as a theological statement about the sacredness of water. The modern conservation project installs pumps to keep the water away from the sacred stone. The theological engagement with the flood, the deliberate positioning of the temple within the reach of the sacred waters, was one of the most ambitious and most ill-fated decisions in the history of Egyptian temple architecture. It produced the largest temple in the Theban necropolis. It also produced the most comprehensively destroyed. And the Colossi, the two quartzite guardians, carved from stone that the flood could not dissolve, sitting on foundations that the flood could not undermine, are the survivors of this failed engagement. They are the proof that durability can be achieved on the floodplain, but only in quartzite, only in the hardest stone, only in blocks so massive, so dense, so resistant to moisture, that even the sacred waters of the Nile, returning year after year for 34 centuries, could not wash them away. Visit the Colossi of Memnon as a modern visitor would, arriving, as most visitors do, by road from the east, crossing the west bank of the Nile, and driving through the sugar-cane fields that now cover the site of Amenhotep's vanished temple. The Colossi appear from the road suddenly, two enormous seated figures rising from the flat agricultural landscape like monuments stranded by a receding sea. There is no temple behind them. There is no enclosure wall around them. There is no gateway, no forecourt, no processional avenue. There are just the two statues, sitting in an open field, facing east, staring at the Nile and the sunrise, with an expression that has not changed in 3,400 years. The scale is the first impression. The statues are enormous, 18 meters from base to crown, each one roughly as tall as a 6-story building. The quartzite from which they are carved is warm in color, reddish-brown, veined with quartz, dense and hard and resistant to the erosion that has destroyed softer sandstone monuments throughout the region. The surfaces are weathered but not degraded. The outlines of the figures are still visible. The hands still rest on the thighs. The Neme's headdress still frames the face. The smaller figures of Ta and Mutamwea are still discernible at the feet. The northern Colossus, the singing statue, shows the damage from the 27 BC earthquake. The upper half is a reconstruction, crude blocks of sandstone, stacked rather than carved, placed on top of the remaining lower half by the Roman Emperor Septimius Severus around 199 of the Common Era. Severus's restoration was well-intentioned. It stabilized the statue, preventing further collapse. And this is the critical point: stopped the singing. The repair sealed the cracks and fissures through which the morning dew had evaporated and the morning sun had caused the stone to vibrate. The singing, which had drawn visitors to the Colossi for more than 2 centuries, ceased with Severus's restoration. The silence that followed has lasted for more than 1,800 years. The southern Colossus is better preserved, its original quartzite surface intact, its features more clearly defined, its overall condition more representative of the statue's original appearance. But the southern Colossus never sang. It was the northern statue, the damaged one, the broken one, the one that was cracked open by the earthquake, that produced the sound. The intact statue was silent. The broken statue sang, and the restoration that fixed the broken statue silenced the song. The visitors who came to hear the singing, and there were many from across the Greco-Roman world, left a remarkable record of their visits. The lower portions of the northern Colossus are covered with graffiti, inscriptions carved or painted by ancient tourists who visited the site, heard, or did not hear, the singing, and recorded their experience on the statue's surface. The graffiti are in Greek and Latin, and they include the names, titles, and impressions of visitors, ranging from ordinary travelers to Roman governors, military officers, and at least one empress, Julia Domna, the wife of Septimius Severus, who visited the Colossi during her husband's tour of Egypt. The graffiti are, in their own way, as historically valuable as the statue itself. They constitute one of the most extensive collections of ancient tourist inscriptions in the world, a record of visitor experience that spans roughly 2 centuries, from the 1st century BC to the early 3rd century of the Common Era. The inscriptions reveal the emotional responses of the visitors, their awe at the size of the statues, their wonder at the singing phenomenon, their disappointment when the statue failed to produce its sound. It did not sing every day, and their reverence for the mythological figure of Memnon, whose story they knew from Homer, and whose voice they believed they were hearing from the stone. The scientific explanation for the singing phenomenon remains a matter of debate among physicists and geologists. The most widely accepted explanation involves the thermal expansion of the fractured quartzite. As the morning sun heated the stone, the differential expansion of the various fragments produced vibrations that resonated through the cracks and cavities, generating a sound that was amplified by the structure of the damaged statue. An alternative explanation involves the evaporation of moisture, dew that condensed on the cold stone during the night, evaporating rapidly as the sun struck the surface, producing a whistling or humming sound as the water vapor escaped through the fissures. Both explanations are plausible. Both are consistent with the reported characteristics of the sound: its occurrence at dawn, its dependence on weather conditions, its variability from day to day, and both share a common implication. The singing was produced by the damage. The intact statue did not sing. The damaged statue did. The earthquake that cracked the stone created the conditions for the phenomenon. The destruction was the creation. The flaw was the voice. The physics of the singing phenomenon has been studied by scientists and acousticians who have attempted to replicate the conditions under which the sound was produced. The most detailed modern analysis, published in the mid-20th century, proposed that the sound was generated by the rapid evaporation of moisture from within the porous quartzite. During the night, the stone cooled and absorbed moisture from the air. The desert dew point at dawn in the Theban region is sufficient to produce significant condensation on cold stone surfaces. As the morning sun struck the eastern face of the statue, the surface temperature rose rapidly. The quartzite, which is a good conductor of heat, warmed quickly under solar radiation. The moisture within the stone's cracks and pores evaporated rapidly, producing steam that forced its way through the narrow fissures and cavities of the damaged statue. The escaping steam generated vibrations in the stone, vibrations that were amplified by the cavity formed by the collapsed upper half, producing a sound that was audible at a distance of several hundred meters. An alternative explanation involves thermal expansion alone, the rapid heating of the stone producing differential expansion between the fractured surfaces, causing them to shift slightly against each other, generating a sound similar to the creaking of a heated metal pipe. This explanation does not require moisture and is consistent with the reported variability of the phenomenon. On dry days, the thermal expansion would produce a different quality of sound, or no sound at all, than on moist days. A third explanation, proposed more recently, involves piezoelectric effects in the quartz crystals within the quartzite. Quartzite is composed primarily of quartz, a mineral that exhibits piezoelectric properties, meaning that it generates an electrical charge when subjected to mechanical stress. The rapid heating of the stone produces thermal stress, which produces mechanical deformation, which produces an electrical charge, which produces a physical vibration in the crystal structure. The piezoelectric vibration, amplified by the resonant cavity of the damaged statue, could theoretically produce an audible sound, a high-pitched tone consistent with the descriptions of a lyre string or striking brass provided by the ancient visitors. None of these explanations has been definitively confirmed, and none can be tested on the original statue, which was repaired by Severus and no longer produces the sound. The physics of the singing phenomenon remains, therefore, a matter of informed speculation rather than proven science. The phenomenon existed. The testimony of dozens of ancient witnesses, spanning 2 centuries, leaves no reasonable doubt about that. The phenomenon was produced by the damage. The intact southern colossus did not sing, and the phenomenon ceased when the damage was repaired. These 3 facts are established. The mechanism by which the damage produced the phenomenon is the open question. The Memnon mythology that the Greeks attached to the singing phenomenon was not a marginal or eccentric interpretation. It was the dominant cultural framework through which the phenomenon was understood, a framework that was shared by the most educated and the most sophisticated visitors to the site. The identification of the singing statue with the Trojan War hero Memnon was not a folk belief held by uneducated travelers. It was an established cultural interpretation, endorsed by the leading intellectuals of the Greco-Roman world, recorded in the major geographical and historical texts, and accepted as fact by writers who prided themselves on their rationality and their skepticism. The power of the Memnon mythology lies in its emotional resonance. The story of a dead hero greeting his divine mother at dawn, the story of a son's love surviving death, of a mother's grief expressed in the morning dew, of a voice that speaks across the boundary between the living and the dead, is one of the most emotionally powerful narratives in Greek mythology. The identification of the singing statue with this narrative transformed the acoustic phenomenon from a curiosity into a sacrament, a moment of divine communication, a bridge between the mortal and the immortal, a proof that the boundary between life and death is not absolute. The visitors who heard the singing were not merely hearing a sound, they were hearing a story about love, death, and the persistence of the human voice beyond the grave. The sound was the evidence, the story was the meaning, and the combination, the physical evidence of the sound and the mythological meaning of the story, produced an experience that was simultaneously sensory and spiritual, physical and metaphysical, scientific and sacred. The experience was lost when Severus repaired the statue. The sound ceased, the story lost its evidence, and the Colossi, which had been for 2 centuries the site of one of the most powerful spiritual experiences in the ancient world, became once again what they had been before the earthquake. 2 massive stone statues sitting in a field guarding an entrance that no longer exists. The visitors who carved their graffiti on the northern Colossus were documenting this spiritual experience, recording, in stone, the moments when they stood before the statue and heard, or did not hear, the voice of Memnon. The graffiti are not merely names and dates. They are testimony, the personal testimony of individuals who believed they had witnessed a divine phenomenon, who wanted the world to know that they had been present, that they had heard the voice, that they had stood at the boundary between the living and the dead, and had heard the dead speak. The testimony is still legible, the names are still readable, the dates are still calculable, and the experiences, the pre-dawn darkness, the rising sun, the warming stone, the moment of anticipation, the sound, or the silence, are still imaginable. The visitor who stands before the northern Colossus at dawn, reading the ancient graffiti in the growing light, is standing where the ancient visitors stood, in the same place, at the same time of day, facing the same statue, waiting for the same sound. The sound will not come, but the experience of waiting for it, of standing in the darkness, of watching the sunrise, of listening to the silence that was once a song, is still available, still powerful, still, after 1800 years of silence, eloquent. The earthquake of 27 BC that damaged the northern Colossus and initiated the singing phenomenon occurred at a pivotal moment in Egyptian history. The transition from Ptolemaic to Roman rule. Egypt had become a Roman province just 3 years earlier, following the defeat of Cleopatra and Mark Antony at the Battle of Actium in 31 BC and the subsequent Roman conquest of Alexandria. The country was adjusting to a new political order, the replacement of the Ptolemaic monarchy with Roman provincial administration, the subordination of the Egyptian priesthood to Roman authority, the integration of the Egyptian economy into the broader Roman imperial system. The earthquake, which was sufficiently powerful to collapse the upper half of one of the largest stone statues in Egypt, probably caused significant damage to other structures in the Theban region as well. But the damage to the northern Colossus was the most visible and the most consequential, because the damage produced the singing phenomenon that would make the Colossi famous throughout the Greco-Roman world. The fame spread rapidly. Within a generation of the earthquake, the singing Colossus had become one of the most celebrated marvels of the ancient world. Roman tourists, the educated, wealthy, leisure-class travelers who journeyed through the eastern provinces in search of culture and spectacle, made the Colossi a required stop on the Egyptian itinerary. The Colossi joined the pyramids, the temples of Luxor and Karnak, and the Nile cruise as essential elements of the Roman tourist experience in Egypt. The social dynamics of the ancient tourist experience at the Colossi are revealed by the graffiti. The inscriptions show that the visitors came in groups, parties of friends, families, and official delegations who traveled together and who often recorded their visits in coordinated inscriptions that were carved side by side on the statue's surface. The inscriptions show that the visitors came with expectations. They knew about the singing, they had read about it in the literary sources, and they came specifically to hear it. And the inscriptions show that the visitors were not always satisfied. Several inscriptions record failed visits, days when the statue remained silent, when the sun rose and the stone warmed and the visitors waited in the growing light and heard nothing. The failed visits are as significant as the successful ones. They demonstrate that the singing phenomenon was not reliable. It did not occur every day, and its occurrence depended on conditions, temperature, humidity, wind, that the visitors could not control. The unreliability added to the mystique. A phenomenon that occurred predictably would have been interesting but not miraculous. A phenomenon that occurred unpredictably, that seemed to depend on the will of the divine rather than on the laws of physics, was miraculous. The visitors who heard the singing felt blessed. The visitors who did not hear it felt challenged, invited to return, to try again, to prove their worthiness to receive the divine communication. The Empress Julia Domna's visit to the Colossi, recorded in a graffito on the northern statue, is the most famous of the ancient tourist inscriptions. Julia Domna accompanied her husband, the Emperor Septimius Severus, on his tour of Egypt in the early 3rd century of the Common Era. The tour was both military and religious. Severus was inspecting the military installations of the province, while also visiting the temples and sacred sites that Egypt was famous for. The visit to the Colossi was a highlight of the tour. The imperial couple stood before the singing statue at dawn, listened for the sound, and presumably heard it. Severus's decision to repair the northern Colossus was probably motivated by his experience during the visit. The damaged statue was a religious monument, a site of divine communication, a place where the dead hero Memnon spoke to his mother, the goddess of dawn. Severus, who was personally devoted to Egyptian religion and who had a deep interest in divination and prophecy, may have viewed the repair as an act of piety, a royal gift to the gods, a demonstration of imperial concern for the sacred monuments of Egypt. But the repair had an unintended consequence. The crude sandstone blocks that Severus's engineers stacked on top of the remaining quartzite sealed the fissures through which the sound had been produced. The singing stopped, the divine communication ceased, and the Colossus, which had been for 2 centuries the most famous acoustic phenomenon in the ancient world, fell silent. The silence was immediate and permanent. No ancient source records the singing of the Colossus after Severus's restoration. The graffiti on the statue ceased shortly after the restoration. Evidence that the visitors, who had come specifically to hear the singing, stopped coming when the singing stopped. The Colossi, which had been one of the most visited sites in Egypt, became once again what they had been before the earthquake: 2 massive stone statues, sitting in a field, guarding an entrance that no longer existed. The irony of Severus's intervention is acute. The emperor who repaired the statue destroyed the phenomenon that made it famous. The pious act that was intended to honor the monument silenced the voice that gave the monument its significance. The repair preserved the object and destroyed the experience. The stone was saved. The music was lost. The comparison with modern conservation practice is instructive. Modern conservators like Severus are motivated by the desire to preserve, to maintain, to stabilize, to prevent further deterioration. But modern conservation has learned a lesson that Severus did not know. The lesson that the significance of a monument is not always identical to its physical integrity. A monument can be significant precisely because it is damaged. A statue can be famous precisely because it is broken. A building can be meaningful precisely because it is ruined. And the conservator who repairs the damage may, in doing so, destroy the significance. This lesson, The lesson that damage can be significant is one of the most important and most counterintuitive insights in the history of heritage conservation, and the Colossi of Memnon are the historical case study that teaches it. The earthquake that damaged the statue created the singing. The repair that fixed the statue silenced the singing. The damage was the value. The repair was the loss. And the question, whether the repair was a rescue or a destruction, remains the most troubling question in the history of monument conservation. The construction technique used for the colossi involved not only the monolithic quartzite blocks of the statues themselves, but also a sophisticated system of foundation engineering that has contributed to their survival over 34 centuries. The statues sit on massive sandstone pedestals, rectangular platforms, roughly 5 meters wide and several meters deep, that distribute the weight of these 720-ton statues across a broad area of the underlying bedrock. The pedestals are inscribed with hieroglyphic texts that include the name and titles of Amenhotep III, the name of the temple, and formulae of divine protection that were intended to secure the statues against the forces of destruction. The foundation engineering was critical. A 720-ton statue, sitting on the floodplain of the Nile, is subject to extraordinary forces. The weight of the stone pressing into the soft alluvial soil, the periodic saturation of the soil by the annual flood, the differential settling that occurs when one part of the foundation is wetter than another. A statue that is not properly founded will tilt, lean, and eventually fall. The fact that both colossi are still standing, still essentially vertical, still essentially stable, after 34 centuries of annual flooding, is evidence that the foundation engineering was sound. The builders understood the challenges of building on the floodplain. They designed the foundations to accommodate those challenges, and the foundations have performed as designed, supporting the statues through 34 centuries of annual floods, periodic earthquakes, and the slow, continuous settling of the alluvial soil. The pedestal inscriptions provide important information about the temple itself. They name the temple and describe its dedication to Amun, the king of the gods, the chief deity of Thebes, the god whose worship dominated the religious life of the new kingdom. The inscriptions also record the names of the quarries from which the stone was obtained, providing archaeological evidence for the supply chain that brought the quartzite from its source to the temple site. The inscriptions are, in effect, the ancient equivalent of a construction plaque, a permanent record, carved in stone, documenting the building, its patron, its dedication, and its sources of material. The west bank of the Nile at Thebes, the location of the Colossi and of the entire Theban necropolis, was, in Egyptian cosmology, the realm of the dead. The east bank was the realm of the living, the city of Thebes, the temple of Karnak, the markets and the houses and the daily life of the Egyptian capital. The west bank was the opposite, the realm of the setting sun, the land of the dead, the place where the pharaohs were buried, where the mortuary temples were built, where the journey from life to death was architecturally enacted. The colossi, facing east from the west bank, were positioned at the boundary between the two realms, looking from the land of the dead toward the land of the living, from the mortuary temple toward the city, from the afterlife toward the world that the pharaoh had left behind. The orientation was deliberate. The statues face east, toward the rising sun, toward the Nile, toward the city of the living. The orientation means that the statues catch the first rays of the morning sun, the same orientation that produced the singing phenomenon that made the northern Colossus vibrate at dawn, that drew the visitors from across the ancient world to hear the voice of the dead greeting the morning. The orientation was practical. It maximized the thermal impact of the sunrise on the damaged stone. But it was also theological. The dead pharaoh, sitting on his throne on the west bank, facing east, greeting the rising sun as if he were greeting his own resurrection. The dawn was not merely a time of day. It was a metaphor, a daily reenactment of the moment when the dead are restored to life, when the sun rises from the underworld, when the darkness gives way to light, and death gives way to resurrection. The relationship between the colossi and the dawn is the thread that connects every aspect of their history, from their original construction, facing east, toward the sunrise, to the earthquake that cracked the northern statue, producing a phenomenon that occurred at dawn. To the Memnon mythology, the hero greeting his mother, the goddess of dawn, to the Severus restoration, which silenced the dawn voice, to the modern visitor experience, which is most powerful at dawn, when the light transforms the quartzite and the silence replaces the singing. The dawn is the constant. Everything else has changed. The temple is gone, the singing has stopped, the mythology has been corrected, the conservation has been completed. But the dawn is the same. The same sun rises over the same hills, the same light strikes the same stone, the same transformation, from cold to warm, from dark to light, from silence to the possibility of sound, occurs every morning as it has occurred every morning for 34 centuries. The dawn is the Colossi natural environment. It is the time of day for which they were designed, the moment at which their orientation makes sense, the hour at which their relationship to the sun, to the light, to the landscape is most fully expressed. The Colossi at noon are impressive. The Colossi at sunset are atmospheric. The Colossi at dawn are transcendent, transformed by the light, animated by the color change, positioned at the boundary between darkness and light, between death and life, between the silence that was once a song and the dawn that was once a greeting. The deeper truth of the Colossi of Memnon is the truth about what happens when a monument outlives its context, when a building's guardians survive the building itself, when the doorposts outlast the door, when the sentinels remain after the fortress has fallen. The Colossi were not designed to stand alone. They were designed to frame an entrance, to flank the gateway of the first pylon, to create an architectural threshold through which the visitor would pass on their way into the temple. The Colossi were part of a system of gateways, courts, halls, and sanctuaries that constituted the mortuary temple of Amenhotep III. The statues made sense within the system. Their scale was proportional to the temple's scale. Their orientation was determined by the temple's axis. Their symbolism was part of the temple's symbolic program. Without the temple, the statues are orphans. Massive, impressive, but contextless. Monuments without a context are monuments without a meaning. And yet the Colossi have acquired a meaning that the temple, had it survived, could never have given them. The Colossi have become the most visible monuments on the west bank of the Nile. They have become the first thing that visitors see when they cross to the west bank. They have become the landmark, the orientation point, the visual anchor, the icon that represents the entire Theban necropolis in the popular imagination. The Colossi have achieved a fame that is inversely proportional to their original function. As doorposts, they were secondary. As standalone monuments, they are primary. The loss of the temple has elevated the statues. The disappearance of the context has created a new context, a context of solitude, of monumentality, of two massive figures sitting alone in an empty landscape, facing the sunrise, waiting for a temple that will never return. The Septimius Severus restoration of 199 of the Common Era is a pivotal moment in the history of the Colossi, the moment when a Roman emperor decided to fix what was broken, and, in doing so, silenced what was singing. The restoration was an act of piety. Severus, who was devoted to the Egyptian gods and who visited Egypt on a tour that combined military inspection with religious pilgrimage, ordered the repair of the damaged Colossus as an act of devotion. The crude sandstone blocks that were stacked on top of the remaining quartzite lower half are visible today, rougher, lighter in color, less refined than the original stone. The repair is ugly, but it was effective. The statue was stabilized, the upper half was restored, and the singing stopped. The silencing of the singing statue raises an uncomfortable question about the relationship between preservation and loss. Severus preserved the statue. He also destroyed the phenomenon that made the statue famous. The singing was produced by the damage. The repair of the damage ended the singing. The preservation of the object eliminated the quality that made the object significant. The emperor who fixed the statue broke the music. This is a dilemma that every conservator faces. Conservation is the art of preserving the original, of maintaining the object in its current state, of preventing further deterioration, of stabilizing what survives. But what if the original state is a state of damage? What if the damage is the source of the significance? What if the crack is the voice, and the repair is the silence? Severus chose preservation over phenomenon. He chose the object over the experience. And his choice, well-intentioned, technically successful, aesthetically disastrous, has defined the Colossi for 1800 years. The statues stand, the singing has stopped, and the question, whether the repair was a rescue or a loss, remains unanswered. The paradox of damage as creation that the Colossi of Memnon embody has implications that extend far beyond the specific case of the singing statue. The paradox touches on a fundamental question about the relationship between perfection and significance, about whether the most significant moments in the life of a monument are the moments of its completion or the moments of its damage. Consider the case of the Parthenon, whose ruined state, its roof blown off by a Venetian bombardment in 1687, has become the defining image of Greek architecture. The intact Parthenon would be impressive. The ruined Parthenon is iconic. The damage has elevated the building, giving it a visual power, an emotional resonance, a symbolic weight that the intact building might never have achieved. The same dynamic operates at the Colossi of Memnon. The intact northern Colossus was impressive, an 18-meter-tall quartzite statue of an Egyptian pharaoh. The damaged northern Colossus was magical, a singing stone, a grieving hero, a miracle of the Egyptian dawn. The damage did what the integrity could not. It made the monument famous. This is an uncomfortable insight for conservators, whose professional mission is the prevention and repair of damage. The conservator's instinct is to preserve, to maintain, to stabilize, to prevent further deterioration. The conservator's nightmare is the earthquake, the flood, the vandal, the force that damages the object that the conservator is tasked with protecting. But the Colossi suggests that damage is not always the enemy of significance. Sometimes damage is the creator of significance, the force that transforms a merely impressive monument into a transcendent one, that converts a political symbol into a spiritual experience, that turns a stone doorpost into a singing hero. Severus's restoration of the northern Colossus is the historical test case for this insight. Severus repaired the damage, he preserved the object, he stabilized the statue, and he silenced the song. The conservator in Severus did his job. The Colossus was saved, but the phenomenon was destroyed. And the question, whether the phenomenon was worth preserving at the cost of the object's integrity, is a question that has no easy answer. The object without the phenomenon is merely a statue. The phenomenon without the object would be merely a sound. The combination, the singing statue, the damaged stone that produces music, the cracked surface that generates a voice, was the creation that the earthquake produced. And Severus, in repairing the earthquake's damage, undid the earthquake's creation. The modern excavation of Amenhotep's mortuary temple, the Sarusian project, which has been ongoing since the late 1990s, offers a different model of the relationship between damage and significance. The Sarusian project does not attempt to reconstruct the temple. It does not rebuild the walls, re-erect the columns, or restore the pylons. Instead, it conserves what survives, stabilizing the surviving elements, documenting their positions, and presenting them in a way that makes the original plan of the temple comprehensible to the visitor. The approach is conservative, in the technical sense of the word. It preserves the site as it is, rather than attempting to make it what it was. The ruined state of the temple is accepted as part of its history, a document of the destruction that the building has undergone, a record of the earthquakes, the floods, and the quarrying that reduced the largest temple in the necropolis to a field of fragments. The conservation approach treats the damage not as a problem to be fixed, but as a fact to be documented, a part of the monument's biography, as significant in its own way as the original construction. The December 2025 unveiling of the two restored alabaster colossi, reassembled from roughly 500 fragments over a period of 27 years, represents the project's most spectacular achievement. The colossi, each roughly 14.5 meters tall, were originally positioned at the temple's third pylon, the inner gateway, deeper within the complex than the Colossi of Memnon at the first pylon. They were carved from Egyptian alabaster, a translucent variety of calcite, quarried at Hatnub in Middle Egypt and transported to the Theban West Bank. The alabaster colossi are different in material, in style, and in character from the quartzite Colossi of Memnon. They are softer in appearance, warmer in color, more luminous in the Egyptian light. The reassembly of the alabaster colossi from 500 fragments is a feat of archaeological conservation that deserves comparison with the great rescue operations of Egyptian archaeology. The relocation of Abu Simbel, the relocation of Philae, the reconstruction of the Karnak temples. The fragments, some large, some small, some weighing several tons, some weighing only a few kilograms, were recovered from across the temple site, where they had been scattered by earthquakes, buried by floods, and in some cases removed from the site and reused in other buildings. Each fragment had to be identified, catalogued, positioned, and joined to its neighbors, a three-dimensional jigsaw puzzle of colossal proportions, conducted in the Egyptian sun over a period of nearly 3 decades. The project has also recovered and reinstalled more than 280 statues and fragments of the goddess Sekhmet, the lion-headed guardian figures that originally stood in rows throughout the temple. The Sekhmet statues, each one roughly 2 meters tall, carved from black diorite, have been re-erected at the site in positions that approximate their original locations. The effect is striking. Rows of identical lion-headed goddesses, standing guard over a temple that no longer exists, their stone faces turned toward threats that are no longer relevant. The Sekhmet statues are, like the Colossi, guardians without a building to guard, but they are also witnesses. Witnesses to the scale of the building that housed them, witnesses to the magnitude of the loss. The installation of a water management system at the site, designed to protect the surviving remains from the rising water table that continues to threaten the foundations, is one of the project's most important technical achievements. The water table at the temple site has risen significantly since the construction of the Aswaswan High Dam. The dam that controls the Nile flood also raises the level of the groundwater, creating a permanent moisture problem that was not present in antiquity. The water management system uses pumps and drains to lower the water table beneath the temple foundations, preventing the salt crystallization and stone degradation that groundwater causes in sandstone and limestone monuments. The Sarusian project has transformed the Colossi of Memnon site from a stopping point, a place where tourists pause for a photograph on their way to the Valley of the Kings, into a destination. The site now includes not merely the 2 quartzite colossi at the first pylon, but the 2 newly restored alabaster colossi at the third pylon, rows of Sekhmet statues, fragments of the peristyle court, and the foundations of the temple that are becoming increasingly visible as the excavation progresses. The site is, for the first time in more than 2,000 years, beginning to look like a temple complex rather than an empty field with 2 big statues in it. The silence of the Colossi. The 1800 years of silence that have elapsed since Severus's restoration is not merely the absence of sound, it is the presence of absence, the palpable, atmospheric, experientially significant presence of something that is no longer there. The silence is not empty, it is full of the memory of the singing, full of the testimony of the ancient visitors, full of the mythology of Memnon, full of the physics of cracked quartzite and evaporating dew. The silence contains everything that the singing contained, minus the sound, and the absence of the sound, the one thing that is missing, the one thing that cannot be recovered, the one thing that Severus's repair permanently destroyed, is the quality that defines the modern experience of the Colossi more powerfully than any quality that is still present. This is the paradox of absence as presence. The most significant quality of the Colossi, the singing, is absent, but the absence is more significant than the presence. The visitor who stands before the Colossi at dawn, knowing that the statue once sang and that it will never sing again, is experiencing a silence that is more eloquent than the sound could ever be. The silence speaks, not of Memnon, not of Eos, not of the Trojan War or the dawn goddess or the grief of a divine mother. The silence speaks of loss, of the irreversibility of certain kinds of repair, of the impossibility of recovering certain kinds of damage, of the relationship between destruction and creation, between the earthquake that broke the stone and the music that the breaking produced. The dawn at the Colossi is still worth experiencing. The light still transforms the quartzite. the cold grey stone of the pre-dawn darkness warming to gold, to amber, to the distinctive reddish-brown of the quartzite's natural colour. The transformation is slow. The colour change progresses across the surface of the statues as the sun rises, illuminating first the crowns, then the faces, then the shoulders, then the arms, then the hands resting on the thighs, then the figures of Ta and Mutemwia at the feet. The progression is a performance, a daily performance of light on stone, a natural spectacle that the ancient visitors would have watched while waiting for the singing to begin. The performance continues. The light still performs, the stone still warms, the colours still change, the transformation is still beautiful, and the visitor who watches it, who stands in the darkness and watches the sunrise and the stone glow and the colours deepen, is experiencing the one quality of the Colossi that has not changed in 34 centuries. The singing is gone, the temple is gone, the mythology is gone, but the dawn is the same, the light is the same, the stone is the same, and the experience of watching the sun rise over the Theban hills, of seeing the light strike the quartzite, of feeling the warmth spread through the desert air, that experience is as old as the Colossi themselves. It is the experience that the ancient visitors shared. It is the experience that the Memnon mythology was built on. It is the experience that remains when everything else has been stripped away. The Colossi of Memnon have been photographed, painted, sketched, and described more often than almost any other Egyptian monument. David Roberts painted them in 1838, their massive forms dwarfing the human figures in the foreground, the desert stretching behind them, the Theban hills rising on the horizon. 19th century photographers captured them in the early days of the medium, their images among the earliest photographs of Egyptian monuments. Modern tourists photograph them daily, millions of images, each one capturing the same two statues, the same field, the same morning light, the same patient, weathered, ancient faces. The repetition of the image is itself significant. The Colossi have been depicted so many times, by so many artists, in so many media, that they have become an icon, a visual shorthand for the Theban necropolis, for the west bank of the Nile, for the monumentality and the endurance of ancient Egypt. The icon is powerful, but it is also limiting. It reduces the Colossi to a single image, a single angle, a single moment, stripped of the context, the history, the mythology, and the silence that give the statues their significance. The context is returning. The Sarusian excavation is filling in the background, adding the temple foundations, the recovered statues, the newly restored Colossi to the visual and intellectual experience of the site. The Colossi are no longer alone. They are accompanied by the alabaster Colossi, by the Sekhmet statues, by the emerging plan of the temple that they were built to guard. The background is becoming visible, the context is returning, and the Colossi, which have been the lone survivors of a vanished temple for more than 2,000 years, are beginning, for the first time since the earthquakes and the floods, to look like what they always were: the entrance to a building, the opening of a door, the beginning of a journey that leads, through courts and halls and sanctuaries, into the presence of the pharaoh who built them and the gods he served. The journey is incomplete. The temple will never be fully recovered. The walls will never be rebuilt. The hypostyle hall will never be re-erected. But the journey is beginning. The first steps of a recovery that has been 27 years in the making, and that will continue for decades more. The Colossi, which have been waiting for 34 centuries, will wait a little longer. They are patient. They are quartzite. They are the hardest stone in the Theban necropolis, and they will be there, sitting in their field, facing the sunrise, guarding the memory of the temple that is slowly, patiently, fragment by fragment, coming back for as long as anyone cares to look. The legacy of Amenhotep III in the broader context of Egyptian history is often overshadowed by the fame of his son, Akhenaten, the heretic pharaoh who abolished the traditional religion and attempted to replace it with the exclusive worship of the Aten, the sun disk. The relationship between father and son, between the builder of the largest traditional temple in Egypt and the pharaoh who attempted to destroy the traditional religion, is one of the most psychologically fascinating relationships in Egyptian history. Amenhotep III was the supreme traditionalist. He built temples to the traditional gods. He maintained the traditional priesthoods. He celebrated the traditional festivals. He enacted the traditional rituals. His mortuary temple, with its colossal statues, its Sekhmet guardians, its multiple pylons and courtyards, was the most comprehensive expression of traditional Egyptian religion that any pharaoh had ever produced. And yet his son, the child who grew up in the shadow of this traditionalism, who was raised in the palace at Malkata, who watched his father build the largest temple in Egypt, would grow up to reject everything his father had stood for. The son would close the temples. The son would disperse the priesthoods. The son would move the capital. The son would abolish the gods. The son would attempt, with a thoroughness that was unprecedented in Egyptian history, to erase the religious system that his father had devoted his life to maintaining. The irony is that the son's revolution was made possible by the father's success. Amenhotep III's reign was so prosperous, so stable, so comprehensively successful that the institutional structures of the traditional religion, the priesthoods, the temples, the agricultural estates, had become immensely powerful. The priesthood of Amun at Karnak in particular had accumulated wealth and influence that rivaled the pharaoh's own. The tension between royal power and priestly power, a tension that had been building throughout the 18th dynasty, reached a crisis point in the generation after Amenhotep III and Akhenaten's revolution, the abolition of Amun, the closure of the temples, the transfer of wealth from the priesthood to the crown, can be understood, at least in part, as a response to this crisis. The son destroyed the religion that the father had built because the religion had become too powerful, too wealthy, too influential, too independent of royal control. The mortuary temple of Amenhotep III was a casualty of this intergenerational conflict. The temple, the largest expression of traditional religion in the Theban necropolis, was neglected after the Amarna revolution. The endowments were diverted, the priesthood was dispersed, the daily ritual was discontinued, and the building, deprived of its institutional support, exposed to the floods and the earthquakes, available for quarrying by later pharaohs, began the long decline that would reduce it, within 2 centuries, to the 2 quartzite doorposts that we know as the Colossi of Memnon. The Colossi, then, are survivors, not merely of earthquakes and floods, but of the intergenerational conflict between a father and a son, between a traditionalist and a revolutionary, between the builder of the largest temple and the destroyer of the religion that the temple served. The temple was destroyed not by nature alone, but by history, by the political and religious upheavals that followed Amenhotep III's death, by the neglect that followed the Amarna revolution, by the quarrying that followed the neglect. The colossi survived because they were made of quartzite. The temple did not survive because it was made of sandstone, and the material, the specific physical geological material from which the monuments were made, determined which elements of Amenhotep's vision would endure and which would not. The modern visitor, who stands before the colossi and looks at the empty field behind them, is looking at the archaeological consequence of a family drama, the drama of a father who built the largest temple in Egypt and a son who undermined the religion that sustained it. The temple is gone, the colossi remain, and the gap between the two, the vast empty, cane-covered gap between the surviving doorposts and the vanished building, is the physical expression of the distance between Amenhotep's vision and the history that followed it. The vision was magnificent, the history was merciless, and the colossi, the 2 quartzite giants, sitting in their field facing the sunrise, patient and weathered and enduring, hold the gap between the two. They hold the vision and the history, the construction and the destruction, the temple and the field, the singing and the silence, the father and the son, the past and the present. They hold everything, and they give nothing back, nothing but their presence, their patience, their quartzite permanence, their 34 centuries of silent, imperturbable, sunrise-facing endurance. The endurance is the message, not the singing, not the Memnon mythology, not the earthquake or the repair or the silence that followed. The endurance, the simple, geological, physical fact that quartzite is harder than sandstone, that 720 tons of properly founded stone will survive longer than a temple built on a flood plain, that the guardians will outlast the building they guard, that the doorposts will outlast the door. The endurance is the truth that the Colossi of Memnon teach, the truth that outlasts the mythology, that survives the repair, that persists through the silence, that will still be there tomorrow and the day after and the day after that. When the sun rises over the Theban hills and strikes the quartzite and the stone warms and the colours change, and the Colossi, patient and eternal, face the dawn. Stand before the Colossi at dawn. The sky is pale, the fields are dark, the sugarcane rustles in the morning breeze. The two statues, massive, weathered, patient, sit in their field, facing east, waiting for the sun as they have waited for the sun every morning for 3,400 years. The sun rises. The light strikes the statues. The quartzite, which was dark and cold in the pre-dawn twilight, warms and glows, turning from grey to gold to amber as the sun climbs above the eastern hills. The transformation is gradual but dramatic. A change in colour that seems to bring the statues to life, that makes the stone breathe, that converts the cold monuments of the night into warm, golden, living presences in the morning light. The northern Colossus does not sing. It has not sung for more than 1,800 years, not since Severus stacked his sandstone blocks on top of the fractured quartzite and sealed the cracks through which the music emerged. The silence is absolute, the statue is mute, and the visitor, standing in the dawn light, listening for a sound that will not come, is hearing the absence of the most famous acoustic phenomenon in the ancient world. The absence is itself significant. The visitor who stands before the Colossi at dawn is experiencing what thousands of ancient visitors experienced: the pre-dawn darkness, the rising sun, the warming stone, the expectation of sound. But the visitor is also experiencing what no ancient visitor after Severus experienced: the silence. The complete, permanent, irrecoverable silence of a statue that once sang and that will never sing again. The modern experience of the Colossi of Memnon is defined by brevity. Most visitors spend less than 15 minutes at the site, enough time for a photograph, a quick walk around the bases of the statues, and a brief consultation of a guidebook before reboarding the bus and continuing to the Valley of the Kings. The brevity is understandable. The site, in its current state, does not offer the visual complexity of a decorated temple or the narrative interest of a painted tomb. There are two statues. They are big, they are old, they are weathered, and there is nothing else to see. No temple, no reliefs, no inscriptions, apart from the graffiti, which are difficult to read from ground level. No architectural context that would help the visitor understand what the statues were built for and what they once guarded. The Sarusian project is changing this. The recovery and reinstallation of the alabaster colossi, the Sekhmet statues, and the temple foundations are gradually transforming the site from a photo stop into an archaeological destination, a place where visitors can spend an hour or more exploring the remains of the temple, examining the recovered statues, and beginning to comprehend the scale of the building that once stood behind the colossi. The transformation is ongoing. Each excavation season reveals new elements, each restoration adds new features, and each year the site becomes a more complete and more comprehensible record of Amenhotep's vanished temple. The potential of the site, when fully excavated and presented, is enormous. The mortuary temple of Amenhotep III was, by any measure, one of the most magnificent buildings in the history of ancient Egypt. Its recovery, even its partial recovery, even the documentation of its plan, and the display of its surviving fragments would add immeasurably to the visitor experience on the west bank of the Nile. The site has the potential to become a major archaeological attraction, not merely a photo stop on the way to the Valley of the Kings, but a destination in its own right, comparable to the Temple of Hatshepsut at Deir el-Bahari or the Temple of Ramesses III at Medinet Habu. The realization of this potential depends on continued funding, continued excavation, and the development of an interpretive infrastructure, signage, pathways, informational materials that would help the visitor understand what they are seeing. The current state of the site, with its scattered fragments, its re-erected statues, and its slowly emerging foundations, requires interpretation. The temple is not self-explanatory. The ruins do not speak for themselves. The visitor needs help, needs the archaeologist's expertise, the conservator's knowledge, the guide's narrative, to convert the field of fragments into a comprehensible monument. The Colossi of Memnon are, in this sense, the overture to a symphony that has not yet been performed. The two quartzite statues at the first pylon are the first notes. The opening theme, the announcement of what is to come. The alabaster colossi at the third pylon are the second theme. The continuation, the development, the enrichment of the musical idea. The Sekhmet statues are the chorus. The repeated motif, the obsessive reiteration, the 700 voices singing the same note. And the temple itself, the temple that is slowly emerging from the soil, fragment by fragment, season by season, is the symphony that Amenhotep composed, the symphony that was interrupted by the earthquake, the symphony that Sarusian is conducting, 27 years into a performance that will not be completed in her lifetime. The performance is the point, not the completion. The performance, the ongoing, never finished, always progressing work of excavation, conservation, and interpretation that transforms a field of fragments into a comprehensible monument. The work will never be finished because the temple will never be fully recovered. Too much has been lost, too much has been quarried, too much has been dissolved by the floods and scattered by the earthquakes. But the work continues, season after season, fragment after fragment, statue after statue, and with each season the temple becomes a little more visible, a little more comprehensible, a little more present. The relationship between the colossi and the emerging temple replicates, in reverse, the original experience of the monument. In antiquity, the visitor approached the temple from the front, through the colossi, into the forecourt, through the second pylon, into the peristyle court, through the hypostyle hall, into the inner sanctuaries. The journey moved from the outside to the inside, from the monumental to the intimate, from the colossal statues at the entrance to the sacred shrine at the heart. In the modern era, the experience is reversed. The visitor starts with the colossi, the outermost element, the most visible survival, and moves inward, into the temple site, discovering the deeper elements as the excavation reveals them. The journey moves from the known to the unknown, from the famous to the forgotten, from the two quartzite giants that everyone has seen to the alabaster colossi, the Sekhmet statues, and the temple foundations that almost no one has seen. The reversal is appropriate. The original journey moved from the profane to the sacred, from the outside world to the divine interior. The modern journey moves from the known to the discovered, from the familiar monuments to the emerging remains. Both journeys are journeys of revelation, of progressive disclosure, of the gradual unveiling of hidden things, and both journeys are journeys into the heart of Amenhotep's vision. The vision of the greatest builder of the 18th dynasty, the pharaoh who built the largest temple in the Theban necropolis, the king whose colossi have stood for 34 centuries, and whose temple is, after 3 millennia of absence, beginning to return. The return is not a resurrection. The temple will never be rebuilt. The walls will never be re-erected. The hypostyle hall will never be restored. The pylons will never be reconstructed. The return is a documentation, a recording, a mapping, a cataloguing of what survives. The return is not the temple. It is the memory of the temple. The archaeological memory, preserved in fragments and foundations, displayed on the site, interpreted for the visitor, and preserved for the future. The memory is enough. It is not the temple, but it is the next best thing. And the colossi, the two quartzite giants, sitting in their field, facing the sunrise, waiting for the temple that is slowly emerging behind them, are the guardians of the memory. They have guarded it for 34 centuries. They will guard it for as long as the stone endures. And the stone, quartzite, the hardest stone available to the Egyptian builders, the stone that was chosen specifically for its durability, the stone that has survived 3,400 years of earthquakes, floods, and human intervention, shows no sign of giving way. The guardians stand, the memory endures, and the temple, the largest, the most magnificent, the most completely destroyed mortuary temple in the history of the Theban necropolis, returns. Fragment by fragment, statue by statue, season by season, under the watchful gaze of two massive stone figures that have been waiting patiently for 34 centuries, for the building they were built to guard to come back. The Colossi of Memnon occupy a unique position in the history of Western engagement with ancient Egypt. They were among the first Egyptian monuments to be known to the European world, described by Greek and Roman authors centuries before the modern rediscovery of Egyptian civilization, depicted in European art since the Renaissance, and photographed since the earliest days of the medium. Their fame has been continuous, unbroken from the 1st century BC to the present day, sustained first by the Memnon mythology and the singing phenomenon, then by the European fascination with Egyptian antiquities, and most recently by the mass tourism that has made the Theban West Bank one of the most visited archaeological sites in the world. The continuity of their fame is remarkable. Most ancient Egyptian monuments were forgotten after the end of the pharaonic period, buried by sand, submerged by floods, ignored by the populations that lived around them. The Colossi were never forgotten. They were always visible, too massive to be buried, too hard to be quarried, too dramatic to be ignored. They sat in their field through the decline of Egypt, through the Roman period, through the Arab conquest, through the medieval period, through the Ottoman era, through the French expedition of 1798, through the development of modern Egyptology, through the construction of the Aswan dams, through the rise of mass tourism. They have been a landmark, a fixed point in the landscape, a reference marker, a visual constant in a world that has changed utterly around them. The contrast between the Colossi's permanence and the world's impermanence is one of the most powerful aspects of the visitor experience. The statues have not moved, they have not changed, they have not aged in any way that is visible to the human eye. The quartzite is as hard today as it was when it was quarried. The surfaces are as weathered today as they will be in another century. The expressions on the faces are as composed today as they were when the sculptors finished carving them. The world around the Colossi has changed completely. The temple is gone, the river has shifted, the fields have been planted and replanted thousands of times, the villages have grown and shrunk and grown again. The political systems has changed from pharaonic to Ptolemaic, to Roman, to Arab, to Ottoman, to modern Egyptian. Everything has changed except the Colossi. They are the fixed point. They are the constant. They are the element that persists while everything around them transforms. This permanence is not merely physical. It is psychological. The Colossi represent, for the visitor, the idea of endurance itself, the idea that something can last, that something can survive the earthquakes and the floods and the quarrying and the political upheavals and the religious transformations and the military conquests and the cultural revolutions that have swept through the Nile Valley over the course of 34 centuries. The Colossi are proof that endurance is possible, that a well-made thing, built from the right material, positioned on the right foundation, can outlast everything that the world throws at it. The proof is not abstract. It is physical. 18 meters of quartzite, 720 tons of carved stone, sitting in a field on the west bank of the Nile, facing the sunrise, as permanent and as patient as anything that human beings have ever created. The patience is the quality that the visitor notices last but remembers first. The Colossi are patient. They do not hurry. They do not change. They do not respond to the world around them. They sit. They wait. They face the sunrise. They have been sitting and waiting and facing the sunrise for 34 centuries, and they show no sign of impatience, no sign of frustration, no sign of weariness. The patience is monumental as the statues themselves, as massive as the quartzite, as enduring as the stone. The patience is the Colossi's most impressive quality. Not their size, not their age, not their history, but their patience, their willingness to sit, their willingness to wait, their willingness to endure. The endurance continues, the excavation continues, the sun continues to rise, the stone continues to warm, and the Colossi, the two quartzite giants, the last survivors of the largest mortuary temple in the history of the Theban necropolis, the doorposts without a door, the guardians without a building, the sentinels who have outlived their post by 3,000 years, continue to sit, continue to wait, continue to face the sunrise with the same expression that they have worn for 34 centuries, an expression that is simultaneously regal and patient, imposing and serene, monumental and human. The expression is Amenhotep's, the face is Amenhotep's, the throne is Amenhotep's, and the figures at the feet, Ti on one side, Mutumwea on the other, are Amenhotep's women, Amenhotep's family, Amenhotep's personal statement of love and legitimacy, carved in the hardest available stone, positioned at the entrance to the largest temple ever built, facing the sunrise for as long as the stone endures. The stone endures, the women endure, the king endures, and the temple, the largest, the most magnificent, the most completely destroyed mortuary temple in the history of Egypt, is returning, fragment by fragment, statue by statue, season by season, coming back from the flood and the earthquake and the quarrying and the 34 centuries of silence, coming back to take its place behind the Colossi, where it belongs, where it has always belonged, where it was always meant to be. The Colossi have been waiting for this. For 34 centuries, they are patient, they are quartzite. They will wait as long as it takes. The Colossi of Memnon have played a role in the history of art that extends far beyond their archaeological significance. They were among the first Egyptian monuments to enter the European artistic imagination, depicted in engravings, paintings, and illustrations from the 17th century onward, their massive forms providing European artists with a visual vocabulary for representing the monumentality and the antiquity of Egyptian civilization. The Colossi, more than any other single Egyptian monument, established in the European mind the idea that Egypt was a civilization of colossal scale, a civilization that thought in terms of massive stone figures, vast temple complexes, and engineering projects that dwarfed anything that the European world had produced. This idea of Egyptian colossalism, the idea that Egypt was a civilization of giants, of monuments too large for the human mind to comprehend, of engineering achievements that bordered on the impossible, was shaped in large part by the Colossi. The two quartzite figures, sitting in their field, facing the sunrise, each one taller than a 5-story building, each one weighing more than 700 tons. These figures were, for the European imagination, the proof that the ancient world had achieved things that the modern world could barely imagine. The Colossi were evidence, physical, tangible, measurable evidence, that the ancients had possessed knowledge and skills that the moderns had lost. The Romantic movement of the late 18th and early 19th centuries was particularly drawn to the Colossi, to their scale, their solitude, their melancholy, their setting in an empty landscape that spoke of vanished grandeur and irretrievable loss. Percy Bysshe Shelley's poem Ozymandias, published in 1818, was inspired not by the Colossi of Memnon directly, but by the broader category of colossal Egyptian statues, of which they are the most famous examples. The poem's famous lines, "Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair," capture the romantic response to the Colossi and to the vanished civilization they represent. The works are gone, the mighty are gone, the despair remains, the melancholy awareness that even the greatest achievements of human civilization are, in the end, temporary. The stone endures, the meaning fades, and the statue, the Colossus, sitting in the desert, surrounded by the wreckage of the building it was built to serve, is the most eloquent monument to this truth. The comparison with Shelley's Ozymandias is instructive but imperfect. Shelley's poem describes a monument that is broken. Two vast and trunkless legs of stone standing in a desert, the face half sunk in the sand, the inscription mocking the traveller with its empty boast. The Colossi of Memnon are not broken in this way. They are intact, battered, weathered, reconstructed in the case of the northern statue, but essentially whole. They have not fallen. They have not been half sunk in the sand. They sit upright on their thrones, facing the sunrise, as composed and as commanding as they were on the day they were carved. But the building behind them is gone. The works that the pharaoh would have invited the mighty to look upon, the temple, the courts, the halls, the hundreds of statues, the 35 hectares of sacred architecture, are destroyed. The Colossi survive, the works do not. And the gap between the surviving Colossi and the vanished temple is the gap that Shelley's poem describes. The gap between the ambition and the reality, between the permanence that was intended and the impermanence that resulted, between the mighty works that the pharaoh built and the lone and level sands that replaced them. The sands at the Colossi are not lone. They are cultivated, planted with sugarcane, irrigated by canals, worked by farmers who live in the villages that dot the West Bank. The modern landscape is domestic rather than desolate, a working agricultural community, going about its daily business in the shadow of two colossal statues that have been there for as long as anyone can remember. The domestication of the landscape, the replacement of the vast temple precinct with small-scale farming, is itself a commentary on the relationship between the monumental and the mundane. The temple was monumental. The farming is mundane. The monumental has given way to the mundane. And the Colossi, the last surviving monuments of the monumental, sit in the midst of the mundane, patient and immovable, watching the farmers pass and the tourists photograph and the sunrise and the cane grow, waiting, as they have always waited, for the temple to return. The temple is returning. The Sarusian project, after 27 years of work, has begun to make the temple visible, to uncover its foundations, to recover its statues, to present its plan. The return is slow, the return is incomplete, the return will never be finished, but the return is real. And the Colossi, after 34 centuries of guarding an empty field, are beginning, for the first time since the earthquakes and the floods, to guard something that is recognizably a temple. The guardians are still on duty, the doorposts are still at their posts, and the temple, the largest, the most magnificent, the most completely destroyed mortuary temple in the history of Egypt, is, piece by piece, coming home. So what are the Colossi of Memnon? They are two massive quartzite statues of the pharaoh Amenhotep III, each roughly 18 meters tall, each weighing approximately 720 tons, carved from stone that was quarried more than 600 kilometers from the site and transported to the Theban necropolis to guard the entrance of the largest mortuary temple ever built in Egypt. The temple is gone, destroyed by earthquakes, dissolved by floods, quarried by later pharaohs, reduced to foundations and scattered fragments beneath the sugarcane fields of the West Bank. The Colossi remain, the last visible elements of a building that was, in its day, the most magnificent structure in the Theban necropolis. For roughly 2 centuries, from the earthquake of 27 BC to the restoration of Septimius Severus around 199 of the Common Era, the Northern Colossus sang. The singing drew visitors from across the Greco-Roman world who came to the West Bank at dawn, stood before the cracked statue, and listened for the sound that they believed was the voice of Memnon greeting his mother, the goddess of dawn. The singing was not divine. It was physical, the result of thermal expansion, moisture evaporation, or some combination of the two, operating on the fractured quartzite of the damaged statue. But the experience was transcendent. The visitors who heard the singing described it with awe, as the striking of brass, as the snapping of a lyre string, as a sound that was simultaneously natural and impossible. The singing stopped when Severus repaired the statue. The repair sealed the cracks. The cracks were the voice, and the silence that followed. The 18 centuries of silence that have elapsed since Severus's restoration is the Colossi's current condition. The statues stand. The statues are silent, and the temple they were built to guard is gone, but the site is not dead. The modern excavation of Amenhotep's mortuary temple, led by the Egyptologist Auriga Sarusian and conducted by an Egyptian-German archaeological mission since the late 1990s, has been uncovering the remains of the vanished temple for more than 25 years. The excavation has recovered hundreds of statues and statue fragments, including more than 280 statues of the lion-headed goddess Sekhmet, colossal figures of the king, granite sphinxes, and most recently, 2 massive alabaster colossi that were reassembled from roughly 500 fragments and reinstalled at the temple's 3rd pylon in December of 2025. The reassembled colossi, each one roughly 14 meters tall, carved from Egyptian alabaster quarried at Hatnub in Middle Egypt, represent the most significant restoration of a pharaonic monument in recent decades. The Sarusian project has transformed our understanding of the site. The temple is no longer a void, an empty field between the Colossi and the desert. It is becoming a readable monument, a site where the original plan is comprehensible, where the layout of courts and halls and sanctuaries is emerging from the soil, where the scale and the magnificence of Amenhotep's vision are, for the first time in 3,000 years, becoming visible. The Colossi wait. They have been waiting for 34 centuries, waiting through the temple's construction, through the temple's destruction, through the earthquake, through the singing, through the silence, through the centuries of sand and sugarcane, through the excavation that is, slowly, piece by piece, bringing the temple back. They have waited through everything. They will wait through whatever comes next. The sun rises, the stone warms, the colossi glow in the dawnlight, and the silence that replaced the singing, the silence that Severus imposed, the silence that has lasted for 1800 years, holds the morning in its grip. The silence is not empty. It is full, full of the memory of the singing, full of the names of the visitors who heard it, full of the mythology of Memnon and the grief of Eos, full of the physics of thermal expansion and the acoustics of cracked quartzite, full of the temple that stood behind the statues and the excavation that is uncovering its remains. The silence is full of everything that the singing contained, and of everything that the singing's absence has produced. The silence is the Colossi's current voice. It is not as beautiful as the singing, but it is, in its own way, as eloquent. The statues stand, the temple rises, the silence holds. And the dawn that Memnon greeted, the dawn that Eos wept over, the dawn that warmed the stone and produced the sound, and brought the visitors to the edge of the desert, to hear a voice that was not a voice from a hero who was not a hero, in a temple that no longer existed. The dawn comes again, as it has come every morning for 3,400 years, as it will come tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that, for as long as the stone endures, for as long as the sun rises, for as long as anyone remembers the morning when a broken statue, sitting in an empty field, opened its mouth and sang.